would like to welcome you today in Bucharest. I'm glad that you are for the second time our guest. First time via Skype intervention, now even in person in Bucharest. And I would like to have a little discussion with you regarding different aspects of the Russian foreign policy and domestic policy issues. And I would like to start with a discussion of the most recent events in Russian Federation. I mean presidential elections and the May decrees that can influence the content of the politics in the Russian Federation. How can you appreciate those results of the elections, March elections, and changes in the presidential team?
Thanks. First of all, it's my pleasure being here the second time. Thanks for the invitation. Look, when it comes to the elections, it was no surprise for anyone who's observing Russia even remotely that Vladimir Putin is going to win. There are, of course, some conditions on which they wanted to win, the proportion of votes in favor and the turnout. And as far as we could tell, pretty much everything that they desired, they've accomplished in the most kind of efficient way possible. So basically for the next 6 years or so, he's going to retain his position as the president. With regards to the changes that are being implemented to the government, I mean, despite quite a number of rumors that preceded the actual appointments, what we're seeing now is more or less the same team on the same places. Especially, for instance, when it comes to foreign policy, we're seeing that the very same a team of people on all of the different positions. We are going to be retaining their posts. There's several rumors, especially lately, about Surkov departing his position as the AD on Ukraine. He's going to remain in place. There are once again rumors about Lavrov departing, but obviously that's not going to take place. So generally, what we're seeing is more or less the same team with more or less the same agenda, being that there's no significant reforms that we'll be seeing being implemented in Russia. And for what we could tell now, the general line, sort of the general policy would be to maybe cut expenses to where it would be possible, but I wouldn't say anywhere considerably. But basically extract more money from the Russians. They just recently announced that there's going to be a pension reform, a significant raise of the retirement age. We're not quite sure yet where exactly, what exactly the age would be, because what we're seeing now is what basically is being announced, and there's a great degree of speculation that I think could be of reason that they're going to lower a little bit the age, maybe not 63 and 65, maybe I don't know, a couple of years less than that, but we'll see. And what else was new introduced is the increase of VAT from 18 to 20%, which will pretty much significantly hurt Russian small and medium-sized businesses. And basically all of that is will be putting additional stress on the Russian population, but the key goal here is to basically get more money into the system without reforming the system.
How important it was to announce this tax reform and pension reform now during the World Cup football?
Look, I think the talks about the pension reform are there for, I don't know, maybe a decade or so, but especially for the last 5 to 6 years, we've seen various positions on this matter. It was obvious for some time that it will one way or another take place, and I think for the Kremlin it was quite crucial to find the proper moment that there would be a sort of a huge distraction, which is now, of course, the World Cup, that allowed it basically to announce the retirement age and VAT at the same time, both hugely important issues, while the majority of Russians are distracted and enjoying the fabulous World Cup. So it was highly calculated, and I think they're still evaluating the reaction of the population to see whether how much of the change they would need to implement to the actual laws that would be passed on those matters.
Going back to the diplomacy, you can expect a longer diplomacy crisis in Russian Federation now. we have a lot of complicated regional dossier. How do you expect that the leadership of the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Russian Federation can do some changes in the strategy or not?
Look, it's not exactly the right sort of question in the terms that the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, as far as I understand, are not the decision-making center. It's not the decision-making center. So to some extent, they're basically executing the decisions that are being made by the President and the Security Council and whoever's responsible in what direction. So with most of the cases, Ukraine, Syria, what we're seeing now is that there are no significant sort of desire to drastically alter the status quo for both of those cases. I mean, clearly the most efforts now are being sort of diverted to the U.S.-Russia relations, well, as pretty much ever. And it seems that the presidential administration, the President Putin, I'm personally still hopeful that they could engage Trump in sort of meaningful discussion, sort of have a quick summit maybe this summer, and somehow convince Trump that the way the Western strategy is being formulated now isn't working. It's bad both for the United States and Russia, and then they have to sort of somehow alter the way it is being formulated, and that's how Trump will benefit for his own good. So once again, the United States are being absolutely the core sort of direction for the Russian Federation, and it'll probably remain so for at least another decade. I mean, as I've said, it's not really a decision for the MFA to change those.
When I asked you about the decision-making process, I had in mind that the fact that the Minister of Foreign Affairs will be the messenger for the new narratives of the new presidential terms. In that regard, we can expect some changes in the Russian diplomacy or not.
Look, the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs recently become, I would say, slightly toxic in the sense that, well, especially in the U.S., I mean, you don't want to be near anyone from the Russian embassy, so it's not the MFA who would be the messengers of any sort of change or any sort of policy proposals coming from Moscow. It could be folks from security agencies, the military, or some personal ADs that would be sent in order to convey the message that the Kremlin has in mind. But in this particular case with the United States, Putin himself wants to be sort of the messenger of any meaningful change, if it would be possible, depending on how the meeting with Trump would go. But once again, I'm quite sort of pessimistic that there could be any considerable change, considering that above all the strategic interests of the United States and Russia, Putin's Russia today, divert quite significantly.
Many of analysts are considering that the Putin regime now is afraid of changes. In your opinion, the regime is afraid of structural changes in the economy and politics, or there is a potential risk to arise the internal revenge against the regime, I mean from the social point of view?
Look, I think the Kremlin has always been afraid of its own people, and I mean, look at the whole story of how Kremlin deals with the opposition. I mean, even consider Navalny. I mean, he's one man with the team. He has volunteers across the country. He doesn't have like any sort of elite support. He doesn't have millions of dollars that could finance his campaign. He's pretty much an individual with a message and with an alternative vision for Russia. But he's being sort of taken quite seriously, because we see how much effort, how much resources the state pulls into containing, restraining him, and just making it hard for him to operate. Same as other sort of opposition leaders, both on the left, on the right, on the center. So to some extent, Kremlin is always being afraid of its own people, how they're going to be protesting, and Kremlin is afraid to show them that it is possible to change the situation in the country by protesting as a principle, as such. So this has always been the case, and probably it will be more of a case now, considering that the economic burden the Russians have to endure is much greater, and will be only increasing in time in this new presidency. So we should be expecting more social protests across the country. In terms of structural changes, I mean, there's a conscious decision in the Kremlin not to engage in any meaningful reforms whatsoever. So, the sort of the ideology, the religion of Kremlin, and has been so for quite some time, is the status quo, whatever that might be in their understanding at this moment. But basically, what they are afraid of is the oil price by most. I mean, if the price goes down to $30-40 per barrel, I mean, I would pose considerable risks for Putin's position in the country, because it would be quite hard to maintain a decent economic situation for his presidency.
Is there possible for Putin list's men to take the opportunity to apply some exit strategy from the list? I mean, from the list of the supporters of Putin now.
Look, I think the ones that had the financial means to do so are the ones that have sold their assets in Russia or somehow diverted their assets and left the country already. I mean, the ones that are staying now are pretty much the ones that have calculated that they have their life is better with Putin than without him. I mean, obviously none of them is safe, because as we have seen and are still seeing with the Ulyukayev as the minister, with many like Yevtushenko system and many others, you could be the enemy of the state. You could turn out to be the enemy of the state at any time. So none of them are totally feeling safe. But I assume the majority of them calculate that they are more, they're safer with Putin than with the uncertainty of having something different. So more or less the ones that wanted to leave left already, if we're talking about big business, first of all. And the same goes with the vast majority of Russians who had the financial means. So the one that had the means, and because it's to be honest, it's not that easy to take your things and leave Russia. But the ones that wanted to, they're still doing that. But there's a considerable number of people that left the country over the 5-6 years, and we'll probably be seeing more people, finding options elsewhere. And that's one of the smarter things the regime does, is not closing borders, keeping the door open. I mean, if you don't like it here, just take your things and off you go.
How do you think the lack of democracy or lack of vision about democracy across Europe, I mean in some European countries, can affect in the future the content of the foreign policy of Russian Federation in the neighborhood? And you know what I mean. I mean Hungary, some issues in Poland, or maybe Italy, or not only in those countries. And even the crisis against migration and the crisis in the Eurozone, the struggle between Merkel and Macron on economic issues.
Look, I mean, there's sort of a general belief that Kremlin is in favor of any sort of turmoil that happens in the European Union. I mean, Kremlin does sort of prefer better to deal on individual basis with state officials of each individual state rather than any large institutions such as the EU. So, in some regards, of course, all of those developments are quite welcoming. Mm-hmm. I don't necessarily think that Kremlin could engage, say, with Poland or Hungary to drastically alter the sanctions regime. I mean, if it was Germany that had the sudden regime change and populists coming to power and that had a different message for Russia, that would be the game changer. But so far, what we could tell is that the changes that are happening in the European Union are not enough to drastically alter the Europeans' commitment towards Ukraine and towards containing Russia. So in the long run, it's probably more a question about what the European Union is and what it will be. Because Hungary, Poland, and although those cases are quite different in the nature, are posing many questions of what European Union is and what values it sort of represents. It's clearly not anymore the same vision that we had like 10 years ago about liberal democracy and being liberal with the liberal in its core. And once again, it's kind of a comfortable zone for Russia to engage in, because when Europe is preoccupied with itself, it leaves out more space for Russia to project its power, whether it's economic, cultural, political, whatever. And Ukraine obviously is not the first priority for Europe now with Brexit and domestic developments. So it probably gives Moscow hope that the current foreign policy can outlast the hardliners of the EU today. But once again, I'll be quite doubtful that we could see a drastic change in European policy towards Russia at this moment.
Today, during the discussion, we raised the subject of the situation of the Russian civil society and how we can manage to deal with the crisis of the Russian civil society. In autumn, we will organize here in Bucharest the Forum of Eastern Partnership think tanks. Also, Eastern Partnership Civil Society Forum is a platform where guests from Russian Federation are invited, I mean from civil society, representative of different NGOs. And also we have Fond Romania organizing each year in November or December the Black Sea NGO Forum. And it's also a platform to meet the problems of different NGOs from the region. And we can find here also Russian NGOs. You have explained a little bit the situation of the Russian civil society, but I would like you to focus not only on the situation now, but a little bit on those proposals that you have offered as a solution on how to deal with those NGOs that are still in a bad situation in Russian Federation, and how we can help them to maintain not only the skills, but also to maintain the connection and the link with the European Union, I mean with partners from the European Union. And in this regard, Romania can be a partner for Russian civil society.
Look, you're absolutely right. The majority of Russian NGOs are under terrific stress at this moment. There are several laws that were passed in the last several years that considerably limit the capabilities of those NGOs, and first and bymost in attracting additional funding and just funding in general. But there are still a great number of Russian NGOs, and to some extent, despite all odds, there's a growing number of NGOs, especially when it comes to non-political sort of issues like ecological and maybe to some extent women's rights, but especially the ones that have to one way or another deal with democracy, say elections, rights, political freedoms. They are under immense stress, and I would just repeat myself by saying that it's quite crucial for them to feel that there are basically people in Europe who support their cause and who support them in their mission to at least on their local domestic level to change or to attempt to change the situation in Russia. So what Romania and other European nations can do is pretty much engage them in experience exchange and in various forms of experience, basically exchange and maybe training. But I think the most important thing is just keeping them know that they're not alone, and there are various NGOs, especially in the Eastern Partnership nations, that deal sometimes with a very similar situation, and probably them sharing the experience would only benefit all of the sides. So I honestly think there's with the Eastern Partnership format, there has to be more engagement of Russia in general, many fronts, because there are many similarities, not all of them, but still, and it would be quite important for them to understand the common sort of space the common issues that they have to fight, and maybe they could share experience and help each other in sort of keeping the very important feeling that this is not all for nothing, which especially in Russia's case, when you're looking at another 6+ years of Vladimir Putin and with the same sort of dynamics that are pretty much going down the hill, it is quite important to keep people motivated and knowing that they're not sort of alone in this.
So such initiatives as our can be helpful to maintain this constant dialogue between civil societies, but also to influence in the future maybe somehow the content of our foreign policies.
Well, I think Romania would benefit of knowing more what Russia is about. I mean, there's of course a lot of information about Russian foreign policy, especially when it comes to propaganda and disinformation. But I mean, it's much more complicated than that. There's much more depth in everything Russia, and I think it would only be useful to create this various regional bridges of understanding, because the Romanian sort of understanding of Russia will definitely differ from the German or the Baltic understanding, and your foreign policy would definitely benefit from understanding of kind of Russian domestic developments, and especially if it has to do one way or another with human rights, democracy and institutions. So I mean, it's a win-win situation
for both countries.
Absolutely.
I'd like to thank you. We had today for our Q&A session Mr. Anton BARBASHIN, editorial director for Riddle project. I wish you success with your new project, and I expect that you will come to visit us for many other events in Bucharest. Thank you.
My pleasure.